I'm the one who saved your son. And couldn't save your wife.
My son Marcus is 9 years old now, and he's got burn scars covering roughly 30% of his body from a devastating house fire that happened when he was only 4 years old. His mother didn't make it out that night, and I've been raising him on my own ever since that terrible day 5 years ago. The physical scars have healed as much as they're going to, but the emotional ones for both of us have remained pretty raw and painful. Marcus is this amazing kid, though. Seriously. He's obsessed with space exploration and astronauts, and he builds these incredibly intricate rocket ships out of whatever materials he can find around the house. He's got this resilience that I never could have imagined a child possessing, and he's handled everything life has thrown at him way better than I have as an adult. We moved across town about a year ago because I landed a promotion at work that came with better pay, but also a much longer commute. The new school district was supposed to be excellent, one of the best in the state, actually, so I figured the move would be worth it for Marcus's education and our future. What I completely failed to anticipate was just how cruel children can be to someone who looks different from them, someone whose appearance marks them as an outsider. It started small at first, the way these things usually do. There were whispered comments when Marcus walked by in the hallways, uncomfortable stares during lunch, kids deliberately avoiding sitting next to him like whatever he had might somehow be contagious. But the situation escalated really quickly when one particular student, a boy named Brandon Carter, decided to make my son's existence at school absolutely miserable. Marcus came home one evening while I was helping him work through his math homework, and he asked me something that felt like a punch directly to my gut. He asked me if he was a monster. I was completely taken aback and asked him what he meant by that. He explained that Brandon had been telling him he looked like a monster because of the scars on his arms and chest. Even worse, Brandon had told him that's why his mother died, because monsters can't have normal families like regular people do. I felt this protective rage building inside my chest, the kind of fury that only a parent watching their child suffer can truly understand. I knelt down to Marcus's eye level and told him very firmly that he was not a monster, that he was brave and kind and intelligent, and the best son any father could possibly ask for. I explained that his scars were proof he was a survivor, proof that he was stronger than anything life could throw at him. But Marcus wanted to know why Brandon would say such horrible things if they weren't true. I tried to explain that some people don't understand that being different doesn't mean being less than others. And sometimes when people encounter something they don't understand, they get frightened. When they get frightened, they lash out and say cruel things to make themselves feel more powerful or in control. But my reassurances at home weren't nearly enough to stop what was happening at school during the day. The bullying just kept getting worse and worse. Brandon managed to convince other students to ostracize Ethan completely, referring to him as the burned kid and spreading vicious rumors that his scars were from some contagious disease that could spread to anyone who got too close. Marcus started having nightmares again for the first time in over a year, waking up screaming in the middle of the night. Every morning became a battle because he would beg me through tears not to make him go to school. I tried working within the system first because that's what you're supposed to do as a responsible parent. I scheduled a meeting with Marcus's teacher, Miss Rodriguez, who was genuinely sympathetic to the situation, but seemed completely overwhelmed and unsure how to handle it effectively. She explained that she'd spoken to Brandon multiple times about his behavior and had contacted his parents to make them aware of the situation. But she admitted that bullying is such a complex issue with so many factors involved. She mentioned that Brandon was dealing with some significant challenges at home. When I pressed her about what kind of challenges, she said she couldn't share specifics because of privacy concerns, but his family situation was complicated and his father was struggling with some serious personal issues. Next, I met with the principal, Dr. Norris, who was well-meaning, but spent most of our meeting speaking in educational jargon about restorative justice approaches and conflict resolution strategies. She assured me they were implementing a comprehensive anti-bullying program across the entire school. Brandon would be participating in peer mediation sessions, and they were planning a school-wide assembly focused on acceptance and inclusion. It all sounded good in theory, but weeks passed and absolutely nothing changed in terms of Marcus's daily experience. If anything, Brandon seemed emboldened by the lack of any real consequences for his actions, like he'd learned he could get away with pretty much anything. The absolute final straw came when Marcus arrived home with his favorite shirt torn badly. It was this NASA shirt with rockets on it that he absolutely loved and wore constantly. He tried not to cry while explaining that Brandon had grabbed it during recess and ripped it, telling him that monsters and freaks don't deserve to have nice things. That night, after I'd gotten Marcus to bed and he'd finally fallen asleep, I made a decision that I knew the school wouldn't approve of, but I didn't care anymore. The school system had completely failed to protect my son, so I was going to handle this situation myself. I was going to pay the Carter family a personal visit and make sure they understood exactly what their son was doing. I found their address listed in the school directory and drove over there on Saturday morning. The house was located in a modest neighborhood, a small ranch-style home with an overgrown yard that clearly hadn't been maintained in a while and paint peeling off the exterior walls. There was an old pickup truck parked in the driveway and a motorcycle covered with a tarp sitting in the garage. I walked up to the front door with my heart absolutely pounding, fueled by a mixture of anger and determination. I'd rehearsed what I was going to say during the entire drive over. I was going to explain in no uncertain terms that their son was tormenting mine, that they needed to take responsibility as parents and put an immediate stop to it, and that there would be consequences if things didn't change. When the door opened, I found myself face to face with a man who appeared to be in his early 40s. He was tall, with graying hair and these incredibly tired eyes that spoke of someone who had witnessed far too much suffering in life. I immediately noticed there were faint scars visible on his hands and forearms, and he moved with this careful, precise way that people develop when they've been seriously injured and had to learn to compensate for limitations. He asked if he could help me, his voice cautious but not particularly unfriendly. I asked if he was Brandon Carter's father. He confirmed that he was, said his name was David Miller, and asked who I was. I told him my name was Stephen Walsh and that my son Marcus was in Brandon's class at school. I watched as recognition flickered across his face, followed almost immediately by what looked like weary resignation, like he'd been expecting something like this. He said he thought he knew why I was there and invited me inside without any argument. The interior of the house was clean but extremely sparse, furnished with the kind of basic furniture that looked like it had been chosen purely for function rather than any aesthetic consideration. There were a few family photographs displayed on the mantel, and I couldn't help but notice that in all the more recent photos, Brandon was always pictured with just his father. There was no mother visible anywhere in the recent pictures. David asked if I wanted some coffee, gesturing toward the kitchen. I told him bluntly that this wasn't a social call. I explained that his son had been bullying mine relentlessly for weeks now, that he was making Marcus's life absolute a nightmare, and that the school didn't seem to be doing anything effective about the situation. David's shoulders sagged slightly, and he said quietly that he knew, that he'd been trying to work with Brandon on his behavior issues, but Brandon had been very angry lately. He said they'd both been going through an extremely rough patch. I felt my anger rising and told him that going through a rough patch didn't give Brandon the right to torment other children. I asked if he had any idea what his son had been saying to mine. I told him Brandon had been calling Marcus a monster because of his scars and telling him that's why his mother died. David's face went completely pale. He asked me to repeat what I'd just said. I told him again that his son was psychologically torturing an 8-year-old boy because he looked different. David immediately apologized profusely, saying he had absolutely no idea that Brandon was saying things like that to anyone. He'd known there had been some incidents at school, but the teacher had only told him that Brandon was being unkind to another student. She hadn't provided any specifics about the nature or severity of what Brandon was actually doing. David ran his hand through his hair in obvious distress and said the behavior was completely unacceptable, that he would deal with Brandon immediately. I told him it had gone beyond just dealing with Brandon at this point. My son was terrified to go to school every single day. He was having nightmares again after over a year without them. He genuinely believed he was a monster because of what Brandon had been telling him repeatedly. Then, David asked something strange that caught me completely off guard. He asked about scars specifically, wanting to know what kind of scars Marcus had. The question seemed to come out of nowhere and confused me. I asked him why it mattered what the scars looked like. David said, "Please," and there was something desperate and urgent in his voice that I couldn't quite understand. He said he needed to see them. Something in his tone made me reconsider my suspicion. I pulled out my phone and found a recent photo of Marcus at the community pool from last summer, where his scars were clearly visible on his arms, shoulder, and part of his chest. David stared at that photograph for what felt like a very long moment. and I watched as his hands began to shake noticeably. He whispered that he knew those scars, that he recognized them. I demanded to know what he meant by that, how he could possibly know them. David looked up at me with his eyes filled with a pain so deep and profound it was almost physical to witness. He asked me what my wife's name had been. I told him Hannah Walsh and asked why he wanted to know that. He asked about the fire, when it happened and where. I told him it was 5 years ago at the apartment complex on Maple Street, and I felt my blood run cold as I watched his reaction. I asked him how he could possibly know about that fire. David sat down heavily in the nearest chair and put his face in his hands. He said in a voice that was barely audible that he was there that night. He was the firefighter who had pulled my son out of that burning building. I felt like the entire world had just tilted sideways beneath my feet. I stared at this man, this complete stranger who had just claimed to be part of the absolute worst day of my entire life, and tried to process what he was telling me. I said it was impossible. The firefighter who saved Marcus, his name was Miller. David said quietly that his full name was David Andrew Miller, that he went by David but his name tag at the fire department had said Miller. I felt like I was going to be physically sick. I said he was the one, the firefighter who saved my son's life. David nodded and added that he was also the one who couldn't save my wife. The silence that followed those words was absolutely deafening. I looked at this broken man sitting across from me, and suddenly everything made perfect sense. His exhausted eyes that looked like they'd seen too much trauma, his careful movements suggesting old injuries, the visible scars on his hands and arms, the complete absence of Brandon's mother in any of the family photographs on display. I said that he'd been injured in the fire, remembering what the fire chief had told me in the hospital afterward. The firefighter who saved Marcus had been hurt when part of the ceiling structure collapsed on him. David nodded and rolled up his sleeves to reveal much more extensive scarring on his arms that I hadn't been able to see initially. He explained that the collapse had crushed his left shoulder completely, broken 3 of his ribs, and caused second-degree burns on his arms and back. But he said, that wasn't even the worst part of what happened that night. I asked what could possibly be worse than that. He explained that the worst part was that he could only make one trip up those stairs before the building's structure became too unstable to risk another attempt. He'd had to make a choice in that moment. He could save my son, or he could try to reach my wife on the other side of the apartment. He couldn't possibly do both. I felt tears starting to fall down my face, but they weren't tears of anger anymore. They were tears of understanding, of recognition, of shared grief between 2 people who had both lost so much that night. I told him quietly that he had saved my son's life. David said yes, but he couldn't save my wife, and he'd carried that knowledge with him every single day for 5 years. The knowledge that he'd made a choice, and because of the choice he made, a woman died, and a little boy lost his mother forever. I said his name, and my voice was steady when I spoke. I told him he didn't make a choice. He made the only choice that was possible in that situation. He saved a 4-year-old child who needed him. I told him that my wife was already unconscious from smoke inhalation by the time he arrived, that the fire chief had explained to me afterward that she wouldn't have survived, even if he had somehow managed to reach her first. But Marcus had still been conscious, still fighting to survive. David had saved the one person who could actually be saved that night. David looked up at me with complete surprise on his face. He asked if I didn't blame him for what happened. I said, blame him? I told him I'd spent 5 years feeling grateful to a firefighter named David Miller who had risked his own life to save my son. I'd never imagined I would actually get the chance to meet him face to face and thank him personally. We sat together in silence for a long moment, both of us processing this impossible coincidence that had somehow brought our families together. I asked if that was why he'd left the fire department. David nodded and explained that the physical injuries had healed mostly, but the emotional ones never really did. He'd started drinking heavily to cope and having severe panic attacks every single time the station alarm went off. He couldn't do the job anymore because he couldn't trust himself to make those kinds of impossible life or death decisions. And Brandon's mother had left him 2 years ago, saying she couldn't handle being married to a broken man anymore. David's voice was bitter when he talked about her leaving. Brandon blamed him for his mother abandoning them, and he'd been angry ever since, acting out at school constantly and getting into fights. David said he'd been trying to help Brandon work through his anger, but he was barely managing to keep his own head above water emotionally. I asked if Brandon had been taking his anger out on other kids as a result. David said apparently so, and he was deeply ashamed to admit he hadn't realized how severe the situation had gotten. He looked at me with genuine remorse in his eyes and apologized, not just for Brandon's behavior toward Marcus, but for everything. For not being able to save my wife that night. For all the pain that Marcus and I had endured over the past 5 years. I stood up from my chair and walked over to where David was sitting. I said his name and told him to look at me. He raised his eyes to meet mine. I told him very clearly that he had absolutely nothing to apologize for. He was a hero who had saved my son's life and nearly died in the process. The fact that his son had been bullying mine didn't change that fundamental truth about who he was. David said quietly that Brandon didn't know any of this. He didn't know about the fire or about Marcus being the child David had rescued. He just saw a kid with scars and had been cruel to him. I suggested that maybe it was time Brandon learned the truth, that he needed to understand what real courage looked like and what real consequences were for his actions. David was quiet for a long moment, thinking it over. He finally said I was right, that Brandon needed to understand, and that he needed to face what he'd done. He asked where Brandon was currently. David said he was upstairs in his room, that he'd been grounded for the past week because of yet another fight at school. David stood up and asked if I would be willing to stay while he talked to Brandon. He thought Brandon needed to hear this story and needed to meet the boy whose life David had saved, even if Marcus wasn't here today. I explained that Marcus wasn't with me, that he was spending the day at his grandmother's house. David said that was fine, that Brandon needed to hear the truth first anyway. Then maybe after that, we could arrange for the two boys to meet properly under very different circumstances. David called Brandon downstairs, and I watched as a sullen-looking boy of about 9 trudged into the living room. He had his father's dark hair and those same tired eyes, but there was a visible anger in his expression that spoke of pain he was too young to fully understand or process appropriately. David told Brandon in a firm but gentle voice that this was Mr. Walsh, Marcus's father. Brandon's expression immediately became defensive. He said he hadn't done anything wrong. David told him to sit down because they needed to have a serious conversation. For the next hour, David told Brandon the complete story of the fire in detail. He explained about his career as a firefighter, about the particular day 5 years ago when he'd had to make an impossible choice between trying to save a woman or saving a child. He described how he'd carried a 4-year-old boy out of a burning building while part of the structure collapsed around them, how he'd nearly died in the process of making sure that child survived. Brandon listened with growing amazement and horror as his father spoke. David explained that the little boy he'd rescued that night was Marcus, the same boy Brandon had been calling a monster at school. Brandon's face went white as the realization hit him. He started to say something about Marcus, but couldn't finish the sentence. David said that Marcus's scars were proof he had survived something that absolutely should have ended him. Proof that he was braver and stronger than most adults David had ever known in his entire life. Brandon stammered that he'd called Marcus terrible names. David said quietly that, yes, Brandon had tormented a child who had already lost his mother and nearly lost his own life. He'd been cruel to one of the bravest people David had ever met. Brandon began to cry then, and these weren't the angry tears of a frustrated child throwing a tantrum. These were deep, remorseful sobs of someone who truly understood for the first time the magnitude of what they'd done and the pain they'd caused. He whispered that he was so sorry that he didn't know any of this. David pulled his son into a hug and said he knew Brandon didn't know the truth, but that wasn't an excuse for his behavior. We don't get to be cruel to people just because we don't understand their story or their circumstances. Brandon asked if he could apologize to Marcus directly. I spoke up for the first time since David had begun telling the story. I told Brandon that I thought Marcus would appreciate an apology very much. But more than just an apology, I thought Marcus would really value having a friend, someone who could see him for who he truly was as a person, rather than just focusing on his scars. Brandon asked what I meant by being a friend. I explained that Marcus needed someone who understood he was a brave, kind, intelligent boy who just happened to have some scars from something terrible that happened to him when he was young. Brandon nodded eagerly and said he wanted to be Marcus's friend, that he wanted to make up for everything he'd done wrong. The following Monday morning, I walked Marcus to school myself rather than having him take the bus. He was incredibly nervous and clutched my hand tightly as we approached the school building. He asked me what would happen if Brandon was mean to him again. I told him I didn't think Brandon would be, but if he was, Marcus should come find me immediately, and we'd deal with it together. We were barely through the front entrance when Brandon appeared with David right behind him. David and I had carefully arranged this meeting over the weekend, but Marcus had no idea what to expect or why Brandon's father was there. Brandon walked directly up to Marcus with his face serious but genuinely kind for the first time. He said Marcus's name and then said he was sorry. Marcus looked up at me uncertainly, then back at Brandon with confusion. Brandon continued, explaining that he'd been really mean, that he'd called Marcus names and made him feel terrible about his scars, but he said he didn't know the truth, didn't know that Marcus was actually a hero. Marcus asked what he meant about being a hero. Brandon looked back at his father, who nodded at him encouragingly to continue. Brandon explained that his dad had told him the whole story about the fire, about how David had saved Marcus when he was little. He said that Marcus's scars weren't ugly or monstrous at all. They were proof that he was the bravest person David had ever met in his entire career. Marcus's eyes widened in recognition as he looked up at David. He asked if David was the firefighter, the one who had carried him out of the fire. David knelt down to Marcus's eye level, and his eyes were bright with unshed tears. He confirmed that he was that firefighter, and he'd thought about Marcus every single day for 5 years, wondering if he was okay, if he was happy, if he remembered anything at all about that terrible day. Marcus said quietly that he remembered someone holding him, someone telling him everything was going to be okay, and that he was safe now. He asked if that was David. David's voice was thick with emotion when he confirmed that yes, that had been him. And Marcus had turned out okay, so much more than just okay. He'd grown up to become this amazing, incredibly brave young boy. Brandon stepped forward again and said Marcus's name. He explained that he'd been really mean because he was angry about other stuff happening in his own life, and he'd taken all that anger out on Marcus. He said that was completely wrong, and he was truly sorry. He asked if Marcus could maybe forgive him. Marcus looked at Brandon thoughtfully for a long moment, then looked at his father David, then looked at me. He said that I always told him forgiveness is a gift we give to ourselves, not just to other people. I confirmed that was right. Marcus turned back to Brandon and said, okay, he forgave him, but he made Brandon promise that he wouldn't be mean to other kids who looked different or seemed different in any way. Brandon promised solemnly. Then he asked if they could possibly be friends. He mentioned that his dad had told him Marcus liked building things, and he had a huge Lego collection at home, including the big Millennium Falcon set and some rocket sets. For the first time in weeks, I saw Marcus's face completely light up with genuine excitement and joy. He asked Brandon what kind of rockets he had. Brandon started listing off different sets enthusiastically. As the two boys began chattering away excitedly about their shared interests in building and space, David and I stepped aside to give them some space. David said quietly that he wanted to thank me for bringing Marcus there today, for letting Brandon apologize, and for forgiving him. I told him there was nothing to forgive, but I did have something important to ask him. He said anything. I explained that Marcus had been having some really difficult days lately, not just because of the bullying situation, but because he'd been asking more and more questions about the fire, about his mother, about what exactly happened that day. I thought it might really help Marcus to hear the complete story from David, to truly understand that someone had fought for him that night, that someone had risked absolutely everything to save his life. David nodded and said he would be honored to tell Marcus whatever he wanted to know whenever I thought Marcus was ready to hear it. I suggested that upcoming weekend and invited both David and Brandon to come over to our house for dinner. Marcus could show Brandon his collection of space models and rocket ships, and then maybe afterward David could tell Marcus about that day in a way that was appropriate for a 9-year-old to understand. David said he would like that very much. That Saturday evening, David and Brandon came to our house for dinner as planned. It was genuinely the first time in months that I'd heard Marcus laugh so freely and naturally. He and Brandon had bonded remarkably quickly over their shared love of space exploration and building things with Legos. Brandon proved to be a genuinely kind and thoughtful friend once his anger and pain had been redirected into understanding and empathy. After we finished eating dinner, while the boys were playing together in the living room, David told Marcus the story of the fire. He kept it age-appropriate, focusing on the bravery of all the firefighters who responded that night, the critical importance of having working smoke detectors, and how incredibly proud he was of how strong Marcus had been, both that night and in all the years since. Marcus asked if David had been scared during the fire. David said yes, he'd been terrified. But he explained that being scared doesn't mean someone isn't brave. Real bravery means doing the right thing even when you're absolutely terrified, even when every instinct tells you to run away to safety. Marcus asked if that was why David saved him even though he was scared. David explained that he saved Marcus because that's what firefighters do. They protect people, especially children who can't protect themselves. And Marcus, he said, was absolutely worth protecting and saving. Marcus was quiet for a moment, processing everything. Then he rolled up his sleeves and showed David his scars directly. He asked if they looked different now than they had when he was little. David examined the scars carefully with a thoughtful expression. He said they looked like they'd healed beautifully, that Marcus's doctors had done an absolutely amazing job with his treatment and care. But he said what he saw when he looked at those scars wasn't damage or ugliness. Marcus asked what he saw. David said he saw proof that Marcus was a fighter, someone who refused to give up. He saw evidence that Marcus had survived something that would have completely defeated most people, adults included. He said he saw the marks of a warrior. Marcus's eyes went wide and he asked if he was really a warrior. David said absolutely, that Marcus's scars were his battle wounds, and they told the story of a battle he'd won against incredible odds. From that day forward, absolutely everything changed in Marcus's life. Brandon became not just Marcus's closest friend, but also his fiercest protector and defender. At school, whenever other kids would stare at Marcus's scars or ask rude, invasive questions, Brandon would step in immediately and explain that Marcus was a fire survivor, a real-life hero who had been through more than most people experience in their entire lives. David and I developed this unlikely but deeply meaningful friendship that was built on a foundation of shared traumatic experience and mutual respect for what each of us had been through. David started attending AA meetings regularly and working with a therapist to properly address his PTSD and survivor's guilt. I helped him navigate the complicated process of getting his life back on track financially and emotionally, and he helped me understand something crucial, that Marcus and I didn't have to face the entire world alone, that it was okay and even healthy to let other people into our lives and trust them. 6 months after that first confrontation at David's house, he had been completely sober for 4 consecutive months and had found work as a fire safety instructor, teaching elementary school children about fire prevention and safety procedures. Brandon had transformed from an angry, acting-out child into a confident, empathetic boy who actively stood up for other kids who were being bullied or marginalized. One evening, as David and I watched the 2 boys playing together in my backyard, David said something that I think about constantly. He said it was funny in a way. He'd spent 5 entire years thinking he had failed on the day of the fire, thinking he hadn't done enough, hadn't saved enough people, had made the wrong choice. But now he was realizing that saving Marcus wasn't just about that one day. It was about giving Marcus the chance to grow up and become the person he is now. It was about giving me the chance to raise this incredible kid. It was about creating a ripple effect that was still spreading outward and touching more lives. I asked him what he meant by that exactly. He told me to look at Brandon. Just a few months ago, Brandon had been angry and hurting and taking all that pain out on other vulnerable kids. Now he'd learned about real courage and genuine compassion and what it means to stand up for people who need help and protection. That transformation happened because of Marcus, because of the example my son set and the grace he showed in forgiving Brandon. I watched as Marcus patiently helped Brandon build an incredibly complicated Lego rocket structure, the 2 boys working together with the easy, natural camaraderie of true friends who genuinely cared about each other. I told David he was absolutely right. Marcus's scars used to be a source of deep shame for him, something he wanted to hide from the world. Now they'd become a source of strength and pride, and Brandon had learned that real strength isn't about making other people feel small or weak. It's about lifting people up and helping them. A full year after that initial confrontation, David was back to working full-time as a fire safety coordinator for our entire school district. Brandon and Marcus had become completely inseparable best friends who did everything together. And I had learned one of life's most valuable lessons, that sometimes the most unexpected connections and coincidences can become the most meaningful and important relationships in our lives. The scars that had once made my son a target for cruel bullying had become the bridge that connected our family to people who understood our journey in ways that nobody else possibly could. David had saved Marcus's life in that fire 5 years ago. There was no question about that. But in many profound ways, Marcus had saved David's life too, by giving him the chance to see that his actions that terrible night had truly mattered, that the impossible choice he'd made had been the right one, that he was still the hero he'd always been deep down. Sometimes I think about how drastically different our lives would have been if I hadn't made the decision to confront Brandon's father that Saturday morning. If I had just accepted the school administration's inadequate response to the bullying and done nothing more. If I had chosen to transfer Marcus to yet another school in another district, running away from the problem instead of facing it directly. If I had let anger and frustration drive my decisions instead of love and determination to protect my son. But I'm grateful every single day that I made the choice to fight for Marcus no matter what it took. Because in fighting for him and refusing to accept the situation, I found something I didn't even realize we were missing from our lives. We found a family that truly understood our story and our pain. We found friends who saw Marcus's scars as marks of courage and survival rather than marks of difference or damage. We found a community built on the solid foundation of shared experience, mutual support, and genuine understanding. Marcus's scars will always be a part of his story and his identity, but now, instead of being a source of shame or pain or something to hide, they're a powerful reminder of his incredible strength, his will to survive, and the amazing connections that can grow from the most unexpected and unlikely places. They're living proof that sometimes our greatest wounds and deepest pain can actually become our greatest gifts and sources of meaning. And the people who understand our pain the very best are often the exact same people who helped us survive it in the first place, even if we don't realize that connection for years afterward.